Chapter 2, Lesson 3. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about brainstorming our ideas and coming up with some broad musical ideas and musical ingredients that we can use in your music. So at this stage of the game, we're starting with big, broad musical ideas. So let's assume that you've been inspired to write a song based on a simple emotion. Let's go with sad. Now, before you just start strumming some chords, messing around with some lyrics, or getting your hands dirty inside Logic or Pro Tools or whatever DAW you're using, it's really important that you spend time actually thinking about what you can do with your musical ingredients. So the first thing you're going to do is create a mind map with all your musical ingredients or possible ingredients. But for each ingredient, we're going to take it a step further and think about how we can use this ingredient in a way that relates back to your original idea. So we want to think outside the box at this stage. Don't be too critical of any ideas, just let your creativity run a little wild. And simply write everything and anything that comes to mind when you think of your topic. We can always ditch some of these ideas that don't really work later, but for now it's important that you aren't too critical and you're just letting your ideas flow as they come. If you dug really deep in the research phase back in lesson 1 of this chapter, you should already have some really great ideas that you can apply to this step of your process. So let's do a brainstorming exercise together so you understand the concept of how to do this with your own chosen topic. So as I said, imagine that we are writing a song or a piece of music based on the emotion of sadness. Try and think about all the things we can do with our musical ingredients, so pitch, harmony, tempo, rhythm, all the things that we've already spoken about in the last lesson, and how we can use these musical ingredients to represent sadness. So I'd probably write down some ideas like this in my mind map. So the idea of tears falling when you're sad could be represented musically by having repeated notes, for instance. Or perhaps when you're sad, you sigh a lot. So we could have large upward leaps followed by falling notes to represent that kind of physical movement, that kind of sobbing and sighing physical movement that people might have when they're sad. Or perhaps we could choose to write it in a minor key. We all know that minor keys naturally are sadder than major keys. We could also maybe use downward moving chords. Downward motion in either a chord progression or downward moving notes in a melody, they're always going to feel more depressed. They're always going to feel sadder than notes and chords that move upwards. To represent that feeling of isolation when we're sad, perhaps the use of a solo instrument might be quite beneficial. Really think about how you feel when you're sad. We tend to retreat, we go into ourselves, we might lock ourselves away for a little while to process that sad thing that's happened. And so there's that sense of isolation associated with sadness, and that can be represented through the use of a solo instrument. When we feel sad, we might feel empty inside. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to have a really thick musical texture. Having a thin texture represents that feeling of emptiness a lot better. And when we're feeling sad, we often feel a loss of energy. And so therefore, using a high tempo or a high speed probably isn't going to be the best musical ingredient. Having a slow tempo will work much better. Now, I may not use all of these musical ingredients, or I may just choose to use some more than others, but at this stage you're simply writing down as many of these musical ideas that connects to your original topic as possible. Now, what if we were writing a piece of music about my cat, Theo? What musical ideas could we brainstorm that relate to cats? In chapter 1, we learnt that pets and animals can be a great source of inspiration for a piece of music. So let's say that we've gone with that idea as our concept. And we're trying to brainstorm some musical ideas or some musical ingredients that we can use for our piece about Theo the cat. So I'm really going to dig deep here and think about the way cats operate. So let's think maybe about a cat stalking the neighborhood at night. Perhaps that could equate to a slow, measured tempo. Or perhaps I could actually work out the actual pitches of Theo's meow and use that as a basis for my melody. Theo, like most cats, tends to sleep for long periods during the day, and then come nighttime, he darts around like an absolute lunatic. So musically, this could be represented by long held notes in, say, a verse, with more energetic notes in short bursts in the chorus. So at this stage of your songwriting process, there are really no limits on your brainstorming. Try and think of as many musical ideas as possible that connect to your topic. As I said before, you can always ditch the ones that don't really work later, but it's better to have too many ideas at this stage. Now, looking for clues that connect to your original idea is crucial when you're trying to write emotionally appropriate and clever music. Whenever I'm trying to decide on musical ideas for a piece of music I'm writing, I don't just write something that fits a general mood or emotion. I'm constantly looking for things that can inspire my musical choices on a deeper level, and musical choices that always relate back to my original idea in some kind of way. And using musical metaphors can be a great way of doing this. So let's use a couple of examples from film to illustrate this point that I'm trying to make. Now, if I ever get to write music for a Superman movie one day, my melody would probably consist of a number of large leaps to represent the action of Superman leaping off buildings. Does everyone remember that film Groundhog Day? The character essentially gets stuck living the same day over and over. If I ever get to write music for Groundhog Day 2, I might decide to use lots of repeated notes to represent the monotony of his life on repeat. And what about the movie Things Fall Apart? If I was writing music for this film, I might decide to use a chord progression that moves downwards, or even start my score with, say, a full orchestra, but then only have one instrument remaining at the very end. Both of these musical ideas links to that original concept of falling or falling apart. So using these musical metaphors can be really powerful. Film composers use these techniques all the time, but it's also really powerful in a non-film context too. Now, despite having all of these musical ingredients available to you, pitch, speed, rhythm, all the things we spoke about in the last lesson, you need to keep a few things in mind when deciding which ones to use or focus on in your musical masterpiece. Now, first up, people can generally only focus on one thing at a time when they're listening to your music, no matter how clever you are. So it's important that you map out what you want to have in focus in each different section of your track, or in each of the main kind of broad sections. Now, do you want there to be a funky bass line in your verses, for example? Great. Now have that as your main ingredient in all your verses. Perhaps you want to have a soaring melodic line in your chorus. Fantastic. Have that as your main ingredient in all of your choruses. And perhaps you want to have a thin texture in your bridge. Awesome idea. So drop out a lot of your other instruments and make the focus that solo instrument. So don't be afraid to focus in on that one musical ingredient. In fact, I encourage you to do so. The general public listening to your music can really only focus on one thing at a time. So make sure you are drawing focus to whatever that most important ingredient is. Otherwise, your music is just going to sound like a big mess. So perhaps you've decided to use the idea of using large leaps in your melody because that connects to your original idea. Again, make that idea, that musical metaphor, a focus. Don't be afraid to let that flavor really come through. Now, you're making really big, broad decisions about what ingredients are most important at different stages of your composition at this point in your music writing process. You're thinking about the fact that you might want to use large leaps in your melody, but you're not actually choosing which notes to use yet. We'll do that in the upcoming lesson, so keep it really general and really broad at this stage. But whatever broad musical decisions and ideas that you come up with at this stage, you must always be able to answer why. Why are these ingredients so important? How do they connect back to your original idea? If you're writing a piece with your main idea as the emotion of sadness, then choosing to focus on minor harmonies that move downwards with a thin, lonely sounding texture is probably quite a good idea. We haven't actually thought about what those harmonies are yet, or what the actual textures are going to be made up of, but we're thinking of these really broad brush strokes. If you decided to focus on using rhythm and speed as your main ingredients to represent sadness, that's probably not going to be a smart move, and your music's probably not going to be that successful. If your original idea was to write a piece about an object, let's say a Lamborghini, then focusing on speed, rhythm, and texture is probably your best bet, whereas focusing on melody, harmony, or register might be less important ingredients in that particular case. So always try and justify your musical decisions by asking yourself whether they actually fit with your original idea. You will also want to try and aim for a really coherent and consistent musical style. You don't want to have wildly different ideas that change constantly throughout your piece of music. Once you've settled on a few key ingredients that you think are important, try and stick with these. If you've decided to use a funky rhythm, and that's an important ingredient that you want to focus on, then commit to this ingredient as a focus throughout your music. Okay, so don't sort of wildly change the ingredients that you're using between different sections of your composition. And look for musical ingredients that are complementary and that work well together. Again, our original idea of the chocolate cake, you're never going to put tomatoes in a chocolate cake. That ingredient is just jarring in that context. So think carefully about the ingredients that will work together to produce the best musical dish. You don't need 1,000 different ideas or 1,000 different musical ingredients to make a great musical dish. You just need a couple of really key, important and flavoursome ingredients that we can work with and develop.